Omid Aleph. Ayin Aleph Omid Aleph. Let's see, we're in the wide lines. Omar Mar. So we'll find the
Yeah.
um,
It's quite a way down.
Omar Mar. Okay, so let's say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 9. I think 10 lines from the beginning of the wide lines is Omar Mar. Vein
Yep.
Isha Beger. Okay, so in order to, we're just going to repeat one thing from last week in order to jumpstart us here. In our discussion last week, you remember we talked about whether a ger or ger tzedek or a woman can own a slave, and what's the difference between a uh, a yid and a goy, because you can. One of the Gemara wants to say in some cases um, that you can buy a Jewish slave and the halacha should be like a goy. I mean, there's different nuances to that. But the important thing is that we bought a brisa, and the brisa said, just quote me quote the brisa, that the ain isha v'ger konan eved ivri. In other words, neither a woman or a ger tzedek, can own or buy or own an Eved Ivri. So for a woman, it's clear because of Yichud that she can't be alone with a male with a Jewish slave. Different from a goy, different from a Jewish slave, which we said because there isn't the same. In other words, a woman would be far more careful with a goy because he's not discreet, but with a yid, he's discreet. So therefore, she shouldn't be alone with an eved. And a ger himself cannot own an Eved Ivri because a ger cannot be owned. In other words, and the Gemara says that only someone who can be owned can own. And because he's a ger, and we have these sensitivities to a ger cannot be owned cannot be sold into slavery, whatever. So therefore, he can't reciprocate and own. All right, so that was that brisa. Now we're going to pick up on that brisa, and we're going to go deeper into the brisa. Omar Mar. So this is Rav. Amar is Mar, the master Rav. Ve'ein isha v'ger konan eved ivri. Quoting that brisa that neither a woman or a ger can own an eved ivri. Says the Gemara, Nema de lo Gamliel. If you hold of that brisa, then it can't come out like from Shimon ben Gamliel. Again, the Gemara oftentimes does that when you have someone like from Shimon ben Gamliel, who's a great scholar, one of the time. So he comes out on the wrong side of this particular brisa. Why? The Tanya, because we learned in another brisa, and I remember there are hundreds and hundreds of brises which are not quoted in our Gemara, but which are part of the whole fabric of the Mishnah, and they all, so to speak, count. They all
But
have
they're
weight.
all at the same authority level.
Right, so that's what I'm saying. They all have the same weight. Now, why were some published as Mishnah and some not published as Mishnah? So that's a good question. It doesn't mean that in the pecking order they're more important. It could well be that there was a greater majority of Tanoim who supported a particular view, so they cited that in the Mishnah. Because oftentimes it's you have to go by the rabbin, and there are other brises which have less support, or it could be a yachid who's quoting. Now we don't denigrate a Tana because he takes a position that's different than everybody else. That's not necessarily the case. But so there wasn't enough space, so to speak, in the Mishnayos. So they said, we're going to take Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, when he was Mesader, he said, okay, this is how we're going to be Mesader, and everything else will be separate but equal. So it'll be not necessarily in the Mishnah, but it will be in the various brises. So
Was there ever a volume printed of only
yeah,
Bryce?
good question. I wish there was. I've never seen one. But it would be awesome if there could be all the brises that could be collated together into a sefer that would be easy to review. That would be something that would be maybe a tremendous undertaking.
Art
But
Scroll
yeah.
has to
What?
we have to have Art Scroll thinking
Art
about
School. Yeah, yeah. Art School's got to
because
dig into that.
it's just cut and paste.
Yeah,
You could
but
have
it's
it in English translation
no,
there.
no, but it's a tremendous undertaking to be able to collate all of these brises from every source. Obviously, the Gemara mentions these brises, so we know they exist. But to pull them together is another story. So, in other words, we have a brisa, the Tanya. It says in the brisa, "Isha koines hashvachos," that a woman can buy maidservants, women, ve'enakonis avodim, and cannot own avodim for the reason we said before, because she can't be have yichud with a Jew male. That's the brisa. And Rabbi Shimon Gamliel Omer, Rabbi Shimon Gamliel comes and he says, "Avkonis avodim." So gives rise to the question: How? What is Rabbi Shimon Gamliel saying? He's saying that
And
a
she can.
woman has the nemonis, if you will. In other words, that we're not necessarily concerned if she owns an eved that there will be something improper. Now, one of the things we have to remember is that oftentimes, and we're going to see this a little bit later here today also, the Isser, the concern is not necessarily the Isser of a woman having Yichud. That's, of course, a tremendous Isser. It's the Chashash. It's the, the Motzi Shemra. It's the Lashon Hara that comes out of someone saying, "Oh, look at that woman. She lives in a house and she has a male servant and what's going on behind closed doors." That's equally powerful. We know for Ein Hara or for the fact that we have to have sort of a limit of what we allow so that people will not go around and make false accusations. So that's the big concern. It's bad enough if there's something going on, but even if there isn't something going on, the fact that they're alone, the yichud is there's an iser. So here Rabbi Shimon Gamliel says that you can do it. So in other words, we're saying this brisa isha v'ger konan eved ivri, ein isha v'ger konan eved ivri is not like Rabbi Shimon Gamliel, because in that other brisa, Rabbi Shimon Gamliel says openly that afkoinus havodim, that a woman can buy a male servant, not just a maid. So how do we reconcile that? Says the Gemara, afilu tema Rabbi Shimon Gamliel. So we're going to make a distinction here, and it seems to me that this distinction comes out pretty obvious from what we just said before. What's the chiluk? Kan be'eved ivri, v'lo kasha, kan be'eved ivri, kan be'eved kanani. That one brisa that says that you cannot own an Eved speaks by an Eved Ivri, where we said before in the previous brisa that a woman shouldn't be alone because an Eved Ivri, because there will be a discretion there that the woman can count on not going public. So therefore, there's no siyag, there's no fence, there's no guardrail. What will prevent her from having doing something improper when she pretty much knows it's not going to get out because the Eved Ivri is discreet, but an Eved Kanani who is not discreet. Basically, he's all over the place. So he will have no reservation about saying, "Oh, yes, I and the mistress of the house, we've been together, whatever." So therefore, she will be much more discreet. She'll be much more careful with an Eved Kanani. Therefore, the brisa that says that she can't be with an Eved Ivri, that's speaking that she can't be together with an Eved Ivri. That's speaking about an Eved Ivri. The brisa, Rabbi Shimon Gamliel says, "Afkoinus havodim." He means specifically Eved Kanani. That an Eved Ivri, he agrees you can't, but an Eved Kanani you can acquire because there won't be that particular problem. And again, as I said, it's one thing to actually commit something improper. It's another thing just to have someone say scurrilously that, "Oh, look, this woman is harboring, is holding In other words, let's say a woman has a rooming house. And in the rooming house, she has people coming in. So it could be an Evan Ivri who's working in the rooming house. And so if there are, again, from a halacha, if there are other tenants or other people there, we're not so concerned. But what happens if the rooming house is empty and Evan Ivri is the one working and she's there alone? Anyway, these are the nuances of the Gemara that we see that the Tanoim and the Amoraim, particularly the Tanoim here, were very attuned to the different halachas as to what is the difference. Now, the Gemara goes on to elaborate on what I just said. Eved Ivri Tzenualo. And Eved Ivri there's a tznius there that there will not be anything that will come out. Therefore, there's a greater likelihood that she will throw discretion to the wind and say, okay, I'm not going to be caught. Evet Kanani, Poritz law. So we use the term Poritz, Pritzus, that an Evet Kanani doesn't have that sort of refined view that he will be that he'll keep things to himself, so he'll blurt it out. Says, "Oh, I and the mistress are together." So therefore, she will be less likely to want to do something because she will be, outed. Um, so therefore, says Rav Shimon Gamliel, it's okay to own a Eved Kanani because there won't be that kind of a problem. And again, everybody has his own view on what is.
Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel
Yeah.
should have said in his statements,
He
he
should
should
have said
have
in the
said.
statement. Right, right.
And meanwhile, the Gemara is saying, well, he meant it, but
But
you know,
Jay, that's why we have Gemara to help us
yeah,
understand, because everything was in brevity. And there was no long diatribes in the
right,
Mishnah. The Mishnah, the Tanoim would make statements, and then the statements would be probably discussed among other Tanoim, and then they agreed and put it in. So there wasn't room to have all these shaklavataria, to have all of these lengthy discussions, and that's how the Gemara evolved, is because
right. But
it's
I'm
like,
saying when they made statements,
yeah.
they almost should have explained it. Another couple of words would have
Right.
explained Rabbi Gamliel
Yeah.
that he
So
can't.
now, imagine if we had Torah without Rashi. What would we do? I mean, now we're so accustomed
Yeah, yeah,
to say, "Oh, what does this mean?" Well, look at Rashi. So,
right.
to your point, the Torah could have been more. Remember, the
Well,
Torah
for this
had
brisa, the brisa
the Brisa should have
should
had
have had a Rashi or something else that
probably,
went
yeah,
up. Well,
yeah,
that's in the safe that's not been written yet.
Yeah,
right,
but I mean, this is something that happens. You know, we see it from the Mishnah Gemara from 2,000 years ago, but it happens even today in the U.S., but really around the world. The politicians will write a law. They'll think
right,
they know exactly what this means,
but they
and
won't
then
elaborate.
5 years later, some case comes up, and we're trying to go back and interpret. Is this really what they meant or whatever? And sometimes you have situations where, oh, that isn't really what they meant, but that's the way it's written, and now we have to rule by that. Or you go to all the way up to the Supreme Court to try to figure it
You
out.
talk
So
about people writing Sforim today. I think they try to explain exactly what they meant to avoid
to
debates.
avoid these problems, and yet think about it, you have Svarim on Svarim on Svarim and Svarim. We start with the Mishnah, and then the Gemara, and then the Rishonim and Achronim, and the Mishnah Brura, and the commentaries on the Mishnah Brura. It's ad infinitum because what one it seems simple to the person writing it, and
Right. So how many ways can you parse? In other words, you
yeah,
you take away, and that's the whole discussion that we have in this country about interpreting the Constitution.
yeah,
Is it strict construction? Is it not strict
right.
construction? What did they mean when they said? And there's a word, and then you say, okay, what does this word mean? Like you say, sitting around the table, the founders knew what they wanted to
Right.
say, but unfortunately, they left
Yeah.
a little bit of a cloud. So lahavdil in the Gemara, it's the same thing. The Mishnah has is a great degree of brevity, and then it's on the Amoraim to understand, and therefore we have this tremendous machlokes of Amoraim what did this Tana say? What did he mean? And what do we have? We even have a marker that says Tishba Yitaris Teku. What is Teku? We have to come to a point to understand. We don't understand it. We can't come to an agreement what this means. So Teku. We'll wait. We'll listen. We'll wait. Anyway, yeah, so this is the discussion about Ebed Kanani, about Ebed Ivri and Ebed Kanani, and how to look at it. And again, not everybody always agrees, but when the Gemara here says name like Rabbi Shimon Gamliel, this halacha could also be like Rabbi Shimon Gamliel. He doesn't argue on an Ebed Ivri. He only says Ebed Kanani. Now, what does everybody else say about Ebed Kanani? Well, presumably, since we don't see any machlokes that anybody else challenges and says, no, Eved Kanani also not. We don't see that. So in other words, we're going to assume that the other Amoraim saw the distinction and agreed with Rav Shimon Gamliel because he was a heavyweight. And if he made that distinction and the others don't disagree, so everybody agrees there's a difference between an Eved Ivri, Eved Kanani, one you can own and one you can't own. Right. Now, lest we think that this matter is settled, says the Gemara, wait a minute, Elahod Tana Rabbi Yosef. We have yet another brisa. That's why I said a couple of weeks ago, we're going to have vignettes of brises and brises and brises that are all going to sort of add something to our discussion, each having its own sort of point of view. We have another brisa. Rabbi Yosef says in the brisa, so listen to this. This is interesting. Our Malta lo terabe kalba. Now, we've seen this in other Gemaras, and it's an interesting concept. A woman should not own a dog. What's wrong with a woman owning a dog? Because once again, you may have a hava amina, even though a Jewish woman, you can't even conceive that this would happen, that you will have relations with a dog, an animal, which obviously was prevalent at a point in time where people had relations with animals. So if would you have a havamina if you saw a woman walking a dog that there was something improper here? Yet Rabbi Yosef says she shouldn't own a dog, as opposed to a cat or any other, a goat or whatever. Okay, a dog, fine. What else? Velo tashre bar be rav bushbiza. This we kind of commented on before, that she shouldn't have a rooming house that she has, Talmidei Chachamim and others who travel where they can rest for the night. In other words, she shouldn't have like a tavern or a bed and breakfast or anything like that. So again, a general statement by Rabbi Yosef that women should be more careful in how they conduct business or their life. Says the Gemara, Bishloima Bar Beirav. Okay, I get it. When it comes to a Talmud Chacham, Siniolo, then he is in the same category as an Eved Ivri who is discreet. So let's say she seduces him, for instance, and he's not going to say anything. He's a Tznua. So therefore, in order to create a siyag, not even to get into the parsha, she shouldn't have a rooming house where she houses Talmidei Chachamim. Okay, I mean, again, what is the norm? But let's just say we understand that particular concept. Ela kalba, but when it comes to a dog, given the masrich ba. So this is very interesting. I wasn't aware of this. Given the masrich ba, says the Gemara that if there was something going on between a person, a woman, and a dog, then the dog would react differently to her than if there wasn't. Meaning that if there was something going on, then the masrich ba means that he would be very close with her, or perhaps there would be something that people would realize, uh-oh, something's going on here. This is not a normal relation where a woman has an animal. So this is almost like the Eved Kanani. In other words, there are clear simonim. It's obvious to everybody that there's something going on. So l'chayra, we can make the same distinction. I understand by a rooming house with Talmidei Chachamim, that even though he's a Talmid Chacham, but if he were to fall if he were to fall, then he wouldn't say anything because it's embarrassing. He wouldn't say, therefore, don't even go there, so there shouldn't be a problem. But with an animal, everybody knows says that inherently is what the Gemara is saying that if you have a relationship or you're with an animal that animal will react differently to you in public and everybody will say uh-oh something's going on over there. Again, I'm not familiar with this. I don't know if any of us are. Maybe a pet owner has a different perspective on something like this, but the fact of the matter is the Gemara is saying there is something that would be a signal so she wouldn't do it, just like she wouldn't go with an Avid Kanani who would blab all over the place,
Hold
right?
on.
Okay, so given the Misrachwa, Mirtada, then she would be afraid. Mirtada, she'd be afraid to have relations with the dog. So what does the Brisa mean that she shouldn't have a dog and she shouldn't and she shouldn't have a rooming house with Talmidei Chachamim? What does that actually mean? So the Gemara says, Omre, given the Chishara delay, Umtza. So again, for those who have animals, um, the same kind of reaction that might occur when a woman walks a dog with whom she has a close relationship with is the same as if the Gemara says umtza she gave him raw meat or some treat that he is able to Masrich Basrei, he would also have this kind of strong feeling for her is because she gave him. I mean, today we feel. I guess in those days, animals didn't get regular diets. They didn't get Purina dog chow or whatever it is that on a daddy diet. So they got only scraps. So if someone took a piece of meat and gave him a piece of meat, that's like hitting the jackpot. So the animal would have a very strong reaction to the person who was feeding them with that. So the Gemara says that we're not worried that the dog will react to the woman because of the relationship. The dog would react to the woman in not only if there was a close relationship, but if she fed him, if she basically gave him a good meal, the dog would, again, this is something we have to sort of understand what the Gemara is telling us, is that you can't say that because the animal would react, therefore, it's a good enough reason not to have the dog. So again, the Gemara wants to say, Mishum Unsa de Charle who de Misrach. And people will say, oh, you know why the animal is close to her is because of the meat. So anyway, what we see from this is again a different brisa that comes to tell us how one should conduct themselves. And obviously, we're 2,000, we're a couple of thousand years later, 200 centuries. So from the time of the Gemara, do we have those same concerns today? I would think not, that today there is no halacha that says a woman should not own an animal. As far as having a rooming house, there's no halacha that says she shouldn't, but maris ayin is a very strong concept. And if someone were to say and ask a shaila, then the answer probably would be don't go there. Because,
Rabbi, I
yeah,
have two questions.
yes,
As to the dog, in today's world, there are many women who are single or widowed, and a dog provides protection for them.
correct.
So to presume that you're going to have a Doberman or a German Shepherd that someone is going to do something immoral with,
Right.
when in fact they're protecting them, it seems like that overrides the quote unquote temptation. We live in a different time. We don't know
Exactly.
what it was during that
Exactly.
time, but it
Exactly.
would seem the same. The same thing is true if somebody has a 3-story house. When my grandmother Oliver Shalom lost her husband, they rented out the house. She rented out two floors below two other people. So
Right.
it's a separate residence, and we can say she can't be an innkeeper. That means she can't be a landlord that rents property out. It just seems that's how people exist. That's how they subsist. So it just seems like we're going overboard for what is Morris Ian. We as Jews have an obligation not to jump to conclusion, not to speak lashon hara, and yet we are indulging that by saying everyone who does something that may look that way, somebody's going to say lashon hara. It speaks very badly of
Well,
us
so
that we presume that.
I think there's a difference between the dog situation where we can legitimately say that the taiva for that is not here today, etc.
Right.
It's a
Right.
very, very different kind of a thing. But in terms of renting a house, again, so there's a difference. If somebody has two houses, or it's a house, but there's two separate entrances, you can't get from one part to the other, then it should be pretty clear that there shouldn't be any issue at all these days, for sure. But if somebody has take the other extreme, if somebody has a house and they've got five rooms, and they rent out four of them to women, and she rents out four of them to guys, that should be pretty clear that this is just she's running a dorming house and there's not a problem. But on the other hand, and that's if you to just step back a little bit, and now there's only one left, you really have yichud issues. So
Menashe, I think you're on point, but why do we have a concept? And again, to your point, Michael, why should we level accusations against Jewish people that they'll do something immoral? Why not give them the benefit of the doubt? We have a concept, "Lifnei iver lo siten michshel." What does that mean? It means that we want to create a siyag, we'll say a fence. We want to create a barrier that you shouldn't come to Avera. Why do we have on Shabbos, we have we say we make Shabbos before Shkia. Why not make it a Shkia? Shkia happens, we make Shabbos it happen. Because if you make Shabbos at Shkia, there's a possibility you'll be over a lav by overstepping by a minute or three or whatever it happens to be.
well,
So
I
you
think
make it yuck.
that's
What?
a perfect example of this question of, do things change or don't they? Because back in the time of the Mishnah Gemara, and really until a few hundred years ago, you didn't have in most places anything close to a reliable clock. They knew how to calculate sunrise and sunset,
Right,
but the average person, even sometimes a whole city, wouldn't have a good clock. And so because of that, you had to say, okay, we're going to go back 18 minutes, or some places 30 minutes, etc., because if you cut it down too close, people will make mistakes,
right,
not intentionally, not even just because they're running late, but just because they don't have an accurate clock, and it's
right,
cloudy, you can't tell exactly when sunset is anyway, etc.
right, right,
Where today we could say, we've got, down to the second, every shul, every house, even on our wrists, etc. We have these clocks. Why do we need it? We should say candlelighting 2 minutes before Shkia, because nobody could possibly make a mistake. We don't change that.
right,
So
right,
where certain things we change, certain things we don't, and it becomes an interesting question of how do we decide which things we can change due to improvements in society, changes in society, improvements in technology, and so on, and which
right,
things that we say no, we keep it always the way it is.
right.
But we still build in a fence, a wall by pushing back candle lighting before the actual deadline time.
No,
So
that's my point.
Yeah,
That's my point. You could say, you could argue, 1,000 years ago they had to do that because you knew it was the candle lighting is at 8 o'clock. You knew that sunset's at 8 o'clock, but do you know when 8 o'clock really is? No,
yeah,
because your clocks and watches and so on aren't accurate. But and
Everybody
whereas
has
now we've
everybody
got it
has a different.
calculated down to the millisecond. So why do we need 18 minutes?
right, right. It's very interesting. Just as an aside, where we are in Florida, we're on a very high floor, and when you look out, we face due west, and when you look out, you literally to the second see when that sun disappears on the horizon. You can set your life and your clock on it. And so that then we know exactly it's 6:24 and 30 seconds. We literally put our clock up and we look. So to your point, Benasha, today everything is much more detailed. So when the look, la halacha, Michael, there isn't a halacha that says a woman should not own a rooming house and and uh, and therefore be distant from the possibility of being alone with another Jew with a Jewish man. There's no halacha like that. But this is where the siyag, the lifnei iver. How many different ways have we learned in all of our different learning of how a Jew should act with regard to keeping himself distant from something improper? And you ask the question, yeah, but today we're living in a sophisticated society. Why do we need that? Maybe we needed it back then, but why do we need it today? And the answer invariably is that there will be somebody who will make that mistake.
But
Today, someone will overstep, and if one person oversteps, then that could be a problem for everybody else. But halacha is very specific today in terms of what is allowed, what is an actual iser, and what is not an iser. And can you equate maris ayin with an iser? No, because it's not a doctrinal iser, but it's an iser in the world that we live in for the same reason that we keep the 18 minutes, is that everything should have a place where you're not going to be forced and violate. And
but
that's how Jews live. Jews don't
yeah,
live
yes,
on the
but
crust.
this smacks to me of sexism. So you're assuming that a woman will have an immoral relationship with a dog. That's a man speaking. The same thing is true if a woman has to exist and she needs the rent to live.
Yeah.
It's like, well, we assume that women are that way, and halacha looks that way, and men not so much. And it's really, to me, problematic that we don't assume that women will have, in many cases, better than men, restraint
And greater moral
you know, moral turpitude. So, this smacks of not putting yourself in the other person's shoe and to presume, I mean, I don't know how prevalent it was, but God forbid that a woman had committed bestiality. But I dare say that uh it was probably more prevalent, I could be wrong, that men had relations with other men. So it just seems very sexist and condescending to women that it makes those assumptions.
I couldn't agree with you more, but we have the Chazal an expression which again you say it's sexist and you could look at it every different way. It says noshim daten kalos, is that as between men and women, women have a kalos would, I don't know if it's a weaker or if it is a softer, how do you define kalos? That their minds don't work the same as men, and therefore we presume that they need greater protection. You're right, that's a sexist statement. But Chazal said that throughout history, this is proven to be the way we operate, that men are more dominant, right? We know that they're more forceful for the most part. And so women need that extra protection because noshim daten kalas. Therefore, the arrangement of a woman being alone with a man, it may not even be the woman who would initiate, but because she's alone with a man, she'll be, according to the general consensus, more likely to succumb. Not that you will. And
Well,
there, if you went
but
to
the
Reb Moshe, if you came to Reb Moshe, a woman came to Reb Moshe and says, your scenario, I'm an almana and I need parnasa and I have a rooming house and I need the parnasa to rent it out. What would Moshe say? What halachic guidance would Moshe give to a woman under that circumstance? I mean, it's again in his chuvas he writes about all these different and all these cheshbonis. Is you make a calculation, so maybe the woman should have someone with her, a child or some.
Oh, right, yeah.
Right, right. So someone with her, so there won't be that yichud.
The privacy gets broken that way.
That's correct. So, but again, there are ways to get around it. But to your
Sure.
point, I'm not going to argue, Michael. You're right
Rabbi,
that
we have the concept of sota, which is, a husband
can
think
accuse the wife. Right,
can accuse
right,
the wife, can think the wife. The reverse is not true.
right.
And it just seems
But that
like
comes to the same pattern of noshim dat and kalos that women are more. It may or may not be true because I can't
it's
answer
the opposite. The truth is it probably is more so the other way.
the other way. The
Well,
other way.
so 2 points. One is that this example here, if we think about this example here, a woman, ignore the dog thing. That I think we all agree these things have changed over time, and there's no such halacha today. Fine. But in terms of the woman renting out, owning and renting to Talmidim, etc., the the in such a situation, think about it. Presumably, this is an unmarried woman because if she was married, we wouldn't have this problem. But
Well, of
also, there
course.
would be a
Oh,
man
she
who would
might, she
nominally be
might
the
be,
man
I mean,
owning the.
by
she
on
might be,
marriage, you mean she could be a single
she
woman,
could
a
be
widow,
she
Right.
a
could be a
And
divorcee.
widow,
it's a classic example would be a widow. She had this
and the
house. Maybe they
husband
were even
left the
renting it, and now she needs
the
to. Fine.
husband left the estate to her.
Right.
That's how she
Right.
got the place.
Right. That's fine. So, so number one, so we're talking about a single woman, and when we're talking about Talmidim there, that's also presumably single men. So this is the sort of the biggest chance and problem of a yichud situation. If at least one of them is married, we say there are still yichud situations, there are still issues, but
Right.
at least then there is that itself because each one is worried, what if their spouse came in, etc. That already gives a certain level. It's not enough in all cases, but a certain level of protection.
Deterrence.
You
But
know,
here we're talking about entirely, if we're talking about entirely single people, that's a classic yichud, and so it
well,
becomes an issue.
But Menashe, to your point, because you made a point before, if a woman has a three-family house, and Michael, and she lived on the top floor and had two other apartments to rent, and there were separate entrances to each of those apartments, we wouldn't be
Right,
having this discussion. The
right.
I don't know about that because a rooming house can have separate
I'll
entrances.
tell you, in other words, no, but in many cases in a rooming house, you have, let's say,
I understand that, but they could make it such. But I'll just say this too, just to add to the point. We have a mitzvah of hachdosas orchim. And I'll go back to my grandmother who had the three-family house. Both when my grandfather was alive, Oliver Shalom, and after he passed, any visitor who came into town, into New Haven, that was visiting, which knew this stay at my grandmother's house. And whether they were single passing through or whether they were a widower passing through, they stayed there. The presumption was not, God forbid, that something was going to happen. It was a matter of providing that place for someone who was a traveler who had no place to go and no place to eat kosher to be able to stop. I mean, we've got to look at these things in context.
Right. So the most pertinent example that I'm aware of, and we'll talk right about our community, and without mentioning names, there is maybe more than one person in the community who have homes that are large, and they are either widowed or they're alone, and there are people who, like you say, tremendous hachnosas orchim. And Rabbi Einer Zechat Tzaddik Livracha would certainly encourage the people to open up their homes, which they do, but he would make a point and say that if it was a woman traveler, not a problem. But if it was a male traveler, then you had to find some intervening way not to be alone. And one of the suggestions I made was that there should be maybe a male family member or somebody who was in the house so that there'd be some kind of a buffer. So he was very much aware of the mitzvah of Achnasas Orchim and the opportunities that it presented, but he had to balance that against the Maris Ayin, against the potential for an egregious
Well, and I'll give you another thing. I remember one time staying with some people who were also constantly. I mean, I was a guest there. My brother and I were both guests many, many years ago, and and they constantly had guests from all over the place. Now, this was a married couple, but the point being that didn't raise any of these other issues. But the point is that they had so many guests so much of the time they literally would leave the door unlocked. And that alone, you can say maybe needs to be open, whatever. But the point is that there are ways to do things in such a way that, if everybody knows this is the place you go, if you're a Jew in New Haven, the door is literally always open.
right.
That alone can go ahead and solve some of the problem because you never know who's going to show up next. And that's can be, I'm not going to poskin, that can be a way of
Right.
solving these yichud issues. So there can be ways of doing it, as opposed to this example in the Gemara. But again, we may not poskin this way today. But there's an example of Gemara where it sounds more like literally this woman owns a place and she rents a room. She rents rooms, but again, the question is how many at one time and so on.
Right.
Rents rooms to single. She's single. The men are single. She's renting rooms, so presumably they're coming in and out on their own. But it's not like anybody can just walk in off the street. You really raise these issues.
Right. So, which is anecdotally agabe tzedakah b'shtayim. We say that when people go out to collect tzedakah or everything, there should always be shnayim. Why shnayim? Ultimately, the answer is because one will watch over the other. So if you had two men who came into a home where there was no one but a woman who was the landlady, we wouldn't be concerned because it's shnayim. So in other words, the issue, yeah, with one we worry, with two we don't worry because one counters the other. So you see that there was a sensitivity to having this potential of yichud, which maybe 99.9% of the time won't amount to anything, but it will give rise to Maris Ayin, Lashon Hara, or other kinds of negative, impact that, again, Judaism is very, very sensitive to that. That we should not put ourselves in a position that there's even a possibility of doing something improper. So we'll go out of our way to prevent that. And that's, I think, what this Gemara is talking about. It's talking about essentially how do we get around the fact that there may not be a doctrinaire view that says you absolutely shouldn't do it. It's a recommendation, and you have to be careful. And then say, oh, but I'm bigger and better than that, so I won't be a problem because I can control my yetzer, or I won't have an issue or whatever. Unfortunately, life isn't that way. So, Michael, your points are well taken, and it is an imbalance. I will agree with you that the Torah, and especially in the discussions in the Gemara, does have an imbalance, as we see from this Gemara, that women have to be held to
Well,
a different
it's
standard.
an imbalance and it's not an imbalance. I think that the exact same situation in reverse of a single man owning a house and renting out to women would be a problem. In fact, might even be considered far worse because the tend to be more of the problem in such situations. And but we don't even bring it up because that, at least in that society, I think we still see it somewhat more recently, is what's the more likely situation? The
Right.
more likely situation is the woman is hard on her luck and needs to go ahead, and one of the ways she can make ends meet is to rent the house, that the estate that she inherited. And who are the people who are more likely to be traveling for long times, et cetera? It's more likely to be men, whether they're students in the yeshiva or whatever else. So, or they're salesmen, they're passing through, they spend a week in the town or whatever. So the
Those are the
situation,
patterns, right? Those are the
right?
patterns
Those are the patterns. the yichud issue would be largely the same if it was
Oh, for
flipped.
sure. If a man was shouldn't be alone with a single woman, there's no
Right.
question.
But this is the situation that's likely to come up as a more likely to come up as a problem is that the woman needs to go ahead and rent to make ends meet, as opposed to the man, where more likely that he'd go out and get some other, even just a manual labor type of job. And and it's more likely that the young men are the ones traveling through and need to rent. So you put those two together, this is the example the Gemara is going to bring down.
Right, exactly, exactly. Okay, so again, a lot of good discussion on this, and sometimes we just have to think about what is the likelihood, as you say, Menashe, and go with that. Now, the Gemara now turns to a different question. Remember, a few weeks ago, we had the Gemara where Amamar, in other words, Rebbe, made a comment. This was on further up the daf here in Ayin Aleph, and Rebbe said that Ger Tzedek Omer Le'inyan Mechira v'Ger Toshev Omer Le'inyan Ribis. I don't understand. In other words, I don't understand when it says that when the Torah refers to a Ger Tzedek regarding regarding the sale of a slave, which we now have come to a conclusion and understand. And then the second half of that line was the Ger Toshev Amlin Ribis. What is it about a Ger Toshev? Remember, a Ger Toshev is really not I mean, he keeps the Sheva Mitzvahs B'nai Noach, but he's not really a full-fledged member of Klal Yisrael. So the Gemara says, "Any Yodea Mahu." I don't understand what that means, says Rebbe. So we've already now come to the conclusion and understand what the first half means. Now we're going to dig into what is it that Rebbe didn't understand, and what does it mean? Ger Toshev, says the Gemara, Ger Toshev Amalinian Ribis Mahi. Rebbe asked, what does it mean that a Ger Toshev with regard to Ribis? Now, what's the source? The source of all of this is a pasuk in Bahar. The pasuk says as follows, and this is, we have to follow this pasuk. It's two psukim actually. And remember what we said, that if your brother becomes yomuch, lessened, meaning he's poor, he loses his livelihood. Moto yodo imoch, and he's in your, in other words, he's your neighbor. He's not some stranger. He's your neighbor. So, and you see that he has fallen on hard times. Vehechzakta bo, and you should support him, right? You should give him strength. Again, very cryptic words, like we always say. What does the Torah mean? We'll understand in a minute. V'chazakta bo, ger v'toshav, and then all of a sudden it says a ger or a toshav, and v'chai imach, he should live with you. What does that pasuk mean? Again, it's sort of a little cryptic. Now, immediately following that is the following pasuk. Al tikach me'ito neshach v'tarbis. Do not take from him neshach v'tarbis, which we've already discussed at great length, means interest, but there's different types of interest. V'yoresa melakecha, and you should have fear of your God. V'chayechicha imach, and you should let your brother live with you. Again, what does that mean? Okay, then it goes on as kaspachol lusit lo beneshech. Okay, fine. So now that's the source of this discussion, and you see where the ger and tosha fit into this. So now, says the Gemara, but wants to break down the pasuk, that if your brother becomes poor, and he's in your neighborhood, meaning your neighbor, not someone off in a faraway place. You see it in real time that he's suffering. Bo, and you should be mechazik him. So says the Gemara, ger v'toshav, a ger or a toshav, v'chai imoch, and he should live with you. Again, what does that mean? Live with you, literally or figuratively. Al tikach me'ito, now listen very carefully. Al tikach me'ito neshach v'tarbis, don't take from him neshach v'tarbis. V'yeresa molakecha v'chai imoch. Okay, so we read the pasuk. The Gemara here breaks it down in great difficulty. So what's Rebbe's Claire? Why is this pasuk difficult to Rebbe? That's what he's saying. I don't understand. Ger v'toshav, the words ger v'toshav, le'inyan ribbis mahi, how does it fit into this whole pasuk? That was Rebbe's question. So now let's understand the question. What is the question? Reminu, we just made this statement from the Torah for a minu. I'll ask you a kasha from a Mishnah. What's the kasha? Lo v'mehem malvin osa beribis. You want to say that a ger v'toshav, and a toshav is who? Sort of a non-Jew who keeps the seven mitzvahs b'nei Noach. So we're talking about a Jew and a non-Jew, and it says al tikach mi'ito neshach v'tarbis. Don't take ribis. Frek the Gemara, we have a Beferish Mishnah, our Mishnah, Lo v'mehem malvin osa beribis. That when it comes to a non-Jew, you may lend and borrow from ribis. V'chein beger toshav. The Mishnah explicitly says same thing to a ger toshav, not just to a nachri, but to a ger toshav. A ger toshav is considered like a nachri for this purpose. So how is this Mishnah going against the Torah? The Torah says that you shouldn't that v'chzaktabo ger v'toshav al tikach memenu ito nesa v'tarbis. You can't have it both ways. If the Torah says a toshav, a ger toshav, it's ger v'toshav. Remember that it's a ger and a toshav. So if the toshav is someone who is not really a member of the tribe, why do you disqualify ribis? I'll take many ribis. Says the Mishnah, you can take ribis. So we have this clear conflict. And again, this is how we have to understand the Torah, because we're not trying to understand what the Torah said. It's not, okay, the Torah said what it said. We're going to see in a minute why you necessarily can't rely on the written word. When you read the written word, you have one pshat. When you dig into it, you really realize what the Torah is actually saying. It's not saying what you think it's saying.
But so, Rabbi,
Yeah.
is it that halachically you can do that? However, that it's a chilul Hashem. You may be desecrating God's name by virtue of actually charging interest or taking from him, because they'll go around and saying that the Jew is usurious. So is that the thinking here?
But Michael, we know that's not the case, because look in the real world. In the real world, every day of the week, Jew and non-Jew, Jews borrow from banks, or they are banks and they lend to people. Of course, with a Yid, you have to do heter iska, whatever. But to a non-Jew, you don't have to worry about a heter iska. And it's not just Jew; it's our whole mekach umenker, our whole system of economy relies on the fact that you can take interest.
But there's more than that. You could argue that that's the modern thing, because we basically make a heterisk almost automatic and all that kind of stuff. But
we don't make it for a goy.
No, we don't make it for boy. But I'm pointing in terms of how prevalent it is. But more than that, there's another pasuk, to see if I can find. I know there's another pasuk dealing with ribis, where it's not only that it says that where it actually says you can take it from a goy. In other words, so the only question here is, where does the ger toshav fit in?
Right.
But we're specifically, it's not like there's so many other halachos where we say you shouldn't do this you can't do this with a Jew.
Right.
And we say rabbinically, or at least, the moral right thing to do, etc., is to not do that to a goy either.
Right.
But with ribis, it's the opposite.
It's the opposite.
It's 100% forbidden for a Jew. It's 100% permitted for a goy, and the question just becomes, because of the language here, where is a ger toshav?
So that's exactly the point, Menashe. That's why Rebbe said, I don't understand ger toshav for Amalinian ribis. That's the point. What does it mean, a ger toshav linyan ribis? Where does he fit in? There's a halacha that says in the Torah, the ger v'toshav al tikach mi'ito neshach v'tarbis. At least prima facie,
Right.
that's what the pasuk says, and then the interpretation of the Tanoim and of all of the Gedolim, I mean, of all of Jewish interpretation is it's okay. So it's
Right.
okay,
And there's another thing, and I've wondered about this before, which is if you've got in an ideal world, everybody would be either a Jew, observing Torah mitzvahs, or a non-Jew but observing the Shiva mitzvahs b'nai Noah.
right?
So
But that's not the
if
case. I mean, in
that's not
reality,
the case, it's not even close. It's on either account,
right.
but it's not even close. But we say that. But my point being that if that we ever got to that case, would that if we said that ribis couldn't be done with a ger toshav, then it would effectively mean that you couldn't do it with any goy. And we know that that's clearly not the
Right.
case.
So the question is this Ger Toshav, who is not like every other goy, because he has some, something tells him there's certain things that are not appropriate. And by goy, Ever Menachai means nothing. Ever Menachai, right? But by Ger Toshav, you don't eat Ever Menachai. You don't. So in other words, that little spark that separates him from everybody else, how do we evaluate that? How do we treat that? Do we treat him more like maybe we should treat him like a Jew because he has a certain what we call a gefühl, a certain feeling, or do we say no, he's like everybody else? So from the Torah, you get the impression from the language of the Torah is it says ger v'toshav al tikach mi'ito neshech v'tarbis. But yet the construct, the interpretation is not like that. So that's really the kasha here is what is it? What is this mitzias of ger toshav? And that was Rebbe's question. I don't understand what a ger toshav is. Now listen to the answer. The answer will really blow you away. So we are now stuck in trying to understand what it is. Comes Rav Nachman by Yitzchak, right? And Rav Nachman by Yitzchak gives us an answer. Omar Rav Nachman by Yitzchak. Miksiv al tikach me'itam. Does it say you cannot take from them? Remember, grammar counts. Does it say al tikach me'itam neshech v'tarbis? No, it says al tikach me'ito. Ito is the singular. So Rav Nachman by Yitzchak says that even though Ger and Toshav are lumped in the same parsha, the part about Neshech v'Tarbis is me'ito, only from the Ger Tzedek, not from the Ger Toshav. That's Rav Nachman's interpretation as to what the Torah means. Now, you and I, we would never come to that conclusion. Okay, it's a subtlety. It says al tikach me'ito. So we're lumping ger and toshav into ito. But Nachman says you can't do that. The whole thing is in plural, and then the lashon here is by ribis al tikach me ito neshach v'tarbis. Can't take from him. Who's the him? A ger tzedek, but not a ger toshav. So according to Reb Nachman by Yitzchak, we don't have a problem because, and that's how he wants to interpret Rebbe. He wants to say, Rebbe, you know what your problem is that when you read the pasuk, the pasuk seemed to indicate that we lump ger and a toshav together. No, we don't. A ger has one halacha, a toshav is another halacha. When it comes to ribis, which is at the height of the concern, because remember at the very beginning of this parak, we said that the isur of ribis, according to some, you can't do tshuva. It's the ultimate sin. You can't undo what you did. So how does that apply? Now, of course, we're talking about ribbit katsutza, midiraisa. Most of the ribbit, a lot of the ribbis is not midiraisa. But let's just say that in this particular case, you have the severity of ribis, but there's a difference between a ger and a toshav. So that's where Rav Nachman wants to explain Rebbe, and it says no. When you read the pasuk, you have to read it carefully. Al tikach mi'itam. It doesn't say mi'itam. It says mi'ito. So now that at least gives us some pause to say, okay, so that when our Mishnah, when all the Tanoim are coming to the conclusion that it's okay to give ribis or take ribis from a goy, a ger tosha falls into the category of an achri, and therefore it's okay to take ribis. Yes, he has certain elements of that he's similar to what a Jew might do in Shiva Mitzvahs, but that's it.
So,
So
Rabbi, why wouldn't the pasuk distinguish between Ger Tzedek and Ger Toshav?
again, that's exact. You're right. Would it not have been easier for the Torah to be more verbose and to say what you are wanting it to say? What does it say? It uses one word. It says the whole pasuk and says al tikach mi'ito neshech v'tarbis. So the argument is, Michael, it is telling us that. It isn't telling us that in 10 words. It's telling us in one word.
Ito.
What's that?
The word ito
The
is
word
But
ito.
why does it say Ger Toshav? Why wouldn't it say Ger only?
Because the rest of the pasuk refers to a ger toshav. In other words, be sensitive to your neighbor, whether he's a ger or a toshav, that you should vehechzaktabo, and that you should support him, that he shouldn't be foreign to you. In other words, there are things that you should do with a ger toshav, just like a ger tzedek. But when it comes to neshech and tarbis, on that specific point, there is a chiluk that you shouldn't take from the ger, but you may take from the toshav. Now you're going to ask a question: why does the Torah lump them together into one category? And the nominal answer is that the Torah is talking about how one should relate to another human being. And in other words, we're talking about sensitivities. Look, there's no mitzvah to give tzedakah to a guy. There is no such mitzvah. If a guy comes to you for charity and you say, okay, chukas, okay, you want to live in a gentle society, in a Gentile society, so you want to be a good guy. So you give charity to non-Jewish causes.
hospitals or whatever.
And I would say, fortunately, unfortunately, much of the Jewish money these days goes to non-Jewish causes. A fraction goes to what's really a Jewish cause. But the fact of the matter remains is that the halacha doesn't deal with an achri. This has
But
nothing
but
to.
Rabbi, there's a third category of ger, which is someone who doesn't keep the mitzvahs b'nei noach. So they may be idol worshippers. So we're not. So if we say the word ger tzedek, ger toshav, are we lumping all the gerim
No,
together?
we're lumping anybody outside of a ger toshav as not being part of this discussion. So only someone who's a ger toshav who keeps the Sheva mitzvahs, he has a different category. He's not a yid. He's not a Jew.
But we can charge him ribbis.
We could charge him ribbis.
Where it's listed together, it appears even with the at, I mean with the singular,
Yeah.
that it could be a ger toshav and not a ger tzedek.
So therefore comes up Nachman by Yitzchak, and he says the way to understand the pasuk is that you have to treat a ger toshav different than an achri. That's already established.
One step up.
How far do you have to treat him? You don't have to treat him all the way like another Jew, because when it comes to neshech and tarbis, which is a big, big thing, you don't have to worry about it. You can charge him interest or take interest.
So there are three levels of people here.
Yes, yes.
That's the whole point.
That's the point. But the pasuk originally only talks about two levels of people. We're not even concerned
Right.
with that third level of a nachri, of someone who's an idol worshiper and does all those other things. Again, there's a certain element of gentility that you can't sort of poke the bear and go out of your way, to create enmity between you and a non-Jew. You shouldn't do that. And how do you not do that? Because you show, oh, I support your cause, I give to the Boy Scouts of America, or I give to, whatever it happens to be.
Hospitals.
In other words, you're a mensch. You're a mensch, and you don't say, oh, I can't do that. Although I mentioned this before, that there is a shita, which I think is, you have to understand how narrow this is that if a person doesn't give tzedakah properly, then there is a view that that's considered bal tashchis. What does that mean? That means if you don't investigate who you're giving tzedakah to, then it's if you're throwing away your money because you could have given it to someone who truly needed it. I don't know how we go about discovering that other than Rabbi Heinemann has a
Rabbi Heinemann
has
says,
has a system.
sure, sure.
And that's wonderful. But Rabbi Heinemann is a drop in the bucket. I mean, you think about in the larger cause, don't we all get solicitations from every single charity around? Is what do we do? And the dilemma is, should I give? Or if I'm going to give a serious amount of money, am I throwing my money down a rabbit hole? Again, people wrestle with this all the time. This is not just a new phenomena. But the question is, so from our purposes, you're right, Jay, there's three categories, and one category is omitted from this pasuk. The second category, because it has some relationship to a Yid, even though he's not a Jew. So the
Jew.
Gemara, the Torah sort of bifurcates and it says, "V'chazakta bo, v'chayimach." You should let him live with you. We shouldn't cozy up to a nachri, but to a ger toshav, you can have a more of a relationship than you would,
Closer,
right? But
closer relationship, yeah.
yeah, a relationship, right? But al tikach mi'ito. Don't take from the Yid, but you can take from the Ger Toshav. So it's a phenomenal interpretation, and again, it shows us the subtleties of what the Torah is telling us. And without interpretation, you and I and everybody else would have read this every day of the week. You can't
Totally
give
differently.
interest or take interest from a Ger Toshav. That's what the pasuk says. But when you look at the nuance of it, you realize that it is splitting a hair and is telling us one halacha for the ger and another halacha for the ger tzedek and another halacha for the ger toshav. So that begins to understand, Rabbi. We're going to go much more detailed next week, but we already have an answer. In other words, Rebbe's doubt, Rebbe's Claire of Nachman Bar Yitzchak answers it. And he tells us that's what it means. Well, you were worried because I don't understand Ger Toshav Omer Ribbis. What does it mean? It says Reb Nachman Bar Yitzchak. It says Le'inyan Ribbis. You may give Ribbis or take Ribbis because Rebbe was puzzled, just like we are sitting around here today. How do you take Ribbis from a Ger Toshav? It says in the pasuk. So, of course, you have to wonder, Rebbe had the same insight as Reb Nachman Bar Yitzchak. I mean, the word ito and itoch may escape us, but it didn't escape them. So anyway, but again, that's kind of the progression in the Torah is that Reb Nachman Bar Yitzchak came and gave us the Chiddush. Maybe others had the same Chiddush. Anyway, so Mitzvah Shem will stop here, and we'll pick up in more detail next week. But once again,